something unexpected just broke the script of global diplomacy. A sealed envelope traveled across the Atlantic from the Caribbean to the heart of West Africa, carrying a message wrapped in apology and tied with a gold ribbon of reconciliation. Inside, a $600 million offer. When that letter reached Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't even blink. He placed it back on the table and sent it back. No drama, no speech, no negotiation, just silence, the kind that makes history. For many, that decision was madness. For others, it was moral genius. How could a young leader of one of the world's poorest nations refuse $600 million? Was this pride, or was it principle? You see, the fund wasn't just money. It was a mirror reflecting a pattern the world knows too well: buying forgiveness instead of fixing corruption. Jamaica called it a gesture of healing. Traoré called it something else: a purchase of conscience. He asked a single question that echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. Where's the justice in this? That one sentence shattered the illusion that morality can be measured in dollars. Within hours, the headlines called it a diplomatic shockwave. But in truth, it was something deeper: the birth of a doctrine that says dignity cannot be priced. And tonight we take you through the story that changed the moral compass of global diplomacy from Kingston to Ouagadougou, and why one African man's refusal became the loudest yes to integrity the world has heard in decades. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you may find yourself asking, if money can't buy freedom, why do we keep selling it? It began like every other diplomatic ritual: polite letters, official seals, and promises of partnership. For months, behind the polished doors of ministries in Kingston, Jamaica, officials were crafting something they called the Reconciliation Fund, a gesture of healing. A symbolic apology from the Caribbean to Africa, a bridge between two continents that share the same scar. $600 million. That was the number. Large enough to make headlines, generous enough to buy goodwill, and politically useful enough to paint Prime Minister Andrew Holness as a reformer who could finally face history. But beneath the headlines was the fine print, the kind of small, quiet language that changes everything. The money would come with timelines, with oversight, with public endorsements. It would require Burkina Faso to acknowledge Jamaica's leadership in restorative diplomacy. In simpler terms, accept the money and accept the narrative. When that document reached Ouagadougou, the silence in the presidential office was heavy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré read every page, closed the folder, and looked at his advisors. Then calmly, he asked one question: where's the justice in this? He saw through the presentation, the flowery words, the political choreography, the illusion of equality. This was not partnership, it was purchase. For a man who had built his career on self-reliance, integrity, and transparency, the implications were clear. Accepting the fund would mean legitimizing a dangerous precedent: that dignity could be traded for diplomacy, that repentance could be wrapped in paperwork. He had seen it before: deals dressed as gifts, donations disguised as redemption. Whether it came from Europe, Washington, or now the Caribbean, the formula was always the same: pay to look good and keep the system intact. This time, he chose to break the formula. Within hours of the letter's arrival, Traoré issued his response: simple, concise, absolute. Burkina Faso would not accept the fund. Not today, not ever. No speech, no accusation, no outrage. Just a refusal, firm, dignified, and irreversible. Inside Jamaica, the political establishment was blindsided. For months, they had prepared the stage for this historic announcement. Press releases were drafted, interviews, scheduled ceremonies rehearsed. The fund had been designed to show Jamaica's moral maturity and global compassion. But in a single act of rejection, Traoré flipped the narrative. What was meant to be a show of generosity became a global question of sincerity. Was this really about reconciliation, or was it reputation management? Was the $600 million meant to repair history, or to repair Jamaica's image? Those questions spread faster than any official statement could contain. News agencies scrambled to verify the reports. Analysts called it a defiance that rewired the moral economy. And across social media, people were asking the same thing: why would any leader turn down that much money? But those who understood Traoré's philosophy, the people of Burkina Faso, the Sahel, and the growing Pan-African movement, knew the answer immediately. Because this wasn't about dollars, it was about dignity. He had always said that a nation which feeds its pride on foreign aid will eventually starve its integrity. That when you allow money to speak louder than morals, you end up with neither. So he made his choice, and with that one decision, what began as a quiet diplomatic exchange became a global moral event. For Jamaica, it was a political embarrassment. For Burkina Faso, it was a statement of independence. And for the rest of the world, it was a mirror reflecting what most governments fear to confront, that justice without sincerity is just performance. When the envelope was sent back across the ocean sealed again, but unanswered, it carried more than paper. It carried a message to every capital, every ministry, every leader who believes that generosity can replace accountability. You cannot buy the respect of a free people. That was the moment Ibrahim Traoré stopped being just a revolutionary soldier and became the conscience of a continent. When the news finally leaked, the world didn't quite know how to react. At first, disbelief, then silence. Then a flood of noise. In Kingston, the morning headlines were supposed to celebrate a historic partnership. Instead, they read like a political obituary. Burkina Faso rejects Jamaica's reconciliation fund. The story spread faster than the government's press office could contain it. The opposition in Jamaica pounced immediately. In Parliament, voices rose. Was this really reconciliation or reputation repair? Talk radio stations exploded with calls from ordinary citizens demanding answers. Students at the University of the West Indies organized spontaneous debates on national ethics. One placard read, "We don't need apologies. We need accountability." It was a small sentence, but it carried the weight of centuries. Across the Atlantic, the reverberations were even stronger. In Accra University, students held up posters of Ibrahim Traoré with the words, "Africa listens now." In Nairobi, young activists turned his quote, "Where's the justice in this?" into a viral hashtag. From Lagos to Dakar, his face appeared on murals drawn by artists who saw in him something more than a president. They saw a man who had done what their leaders never dared say no politely to power. The Western press, caught off guard, tried to reframe the story. Some called it a symbolic overreaction. Others, a political miscalculation. But the tone was defensive. For decades, Western institutions had defined generosity as a virtue that required obedience in return. Now, one African soldier had turned that logic inside out. He hadn't broken a deal. He had broken a spell. What came next wasn't chaos, it was awakening. Within 48 hours, small gatherings appeared across Kingston's downtown squares. At first, they came to ask questions. Why did he refuse? What did he see that we didn't? But questions soon turned into conviction. Chants filled the air. Dignity has no deadline. Journalists began comparing the moment to the civil rights awakenings of the 1960s, a moral confrontation that started quietly and ended in transformation. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, life went on as usual. Traoré didn't give interviews. He didn't celebrate. He simply carried on with his work, inspecting agricultural projects, visiting local schools, and addressing soldiers in the field. His silence was his speech, because he understood something fundamental: that silence, when rooted in truth, is louder than applause. But the establishment wasn't silent for long. Inside certain Western ministries, internal memos started to circulate. They warned of a growing Traoré effect, a dangerous ideological contagion. One document called it an emerging moral narrative that could undermine existing aid structures. Translation: his example was inspiring too many people. From Port-au-Prince to Pretoria, young leaders began quoting him, "Every no to dependency is a yes to sovereignty." They used his defiance to question the legitimacy of conditional aid trade deals and even apologies linked to money. A quiet movement was forming, one that didn't burn buildings, but burned illusions. And that was what frightened the powerful most. You can suppress protests. You can silence dissent. But you cannot arrest an idea once it enters the bloodstream of a generation. By the third week, the fire had spread beyond politics. In the Caribbean diaspora, London, Paris, New York, marches formed outside embassies with signs reading "Dignity over dollars," "Apologies without conditions." Traoré was right. It wasn't about one man anymore. It was about rediscovering something nations had lost: the moral language of freedom. For too long, small states had traded subjugation for sponsorship. Now, a soldier from Burkina Faso had reminded them freedom begins with refusal. Governments may call it rebellion. The people called it restoration. And as the chants echoed through two continents separated by an ocean but united by exhaustion, the message became impossible to ignore. If the world could hear one voice saying no to corruption disguised as compassion, perhaps it was time to listen before others started to echo it. That was the climax of this story, not an explosion of violence, but an implosion of illusion. The illusion that aid equals virtue. That money equals morality. In that moment, Africa didn't just receive news, it reclaimed its narrative. And for the first time in decades, the Global South stood a little taller. The aftermath of Ibrahim Traoré's refusal was unlike anything the diplomatic world had seen in years. There were no missiles, no sanctions, no fiery press conferences, only an uncomfortable silence that stretched across continents. It was the kind of silence that follows a moral earthquake. In Jamaica, that silence quickly broke into a storm. The Holness administration, once confident of praise, now faced interrogation. Opposition lawmakers demanded transparency. Who approved the conditions of this fund? Why did our government attach strings to an apology? The Prime Minister's answers were hesitant. What had been framed as an act of healing was now seen as a performance of morality. For many Jamaicans, the embarrassment was personal. They had wanted to reach out to Africa, not be exposed as politicians playing philanthropy. Editorials flooded local newspapers, accusing the government of trying to launder reputation through charity. One columnist wrote bluntly, "You cannot apologize with your wallet and call it justice." Across the Caribbean, the debate deepened. In Barbados, talk shows began asking if post-colonial nations had simply replaced subjugation with sponsorship. In Trinidad and St. Lucia, youth groups demanded new guidelines for all foreign aid transparency, traceability, and public consent. The ripple of accountability was spreading, and in Africa, the effect was even more profound. In Ouagadougou, citizens celebrated not with rallies or music, but with quiet pride. For once, an African leader had not bowed to global choreography. People began calling it the Ouagadougou Principle, the belief that reconciliation without reform is regression. Intellectuals, journalists, and even clerics repeated the phrase in speeches, sermons, and classrooms. African Union delegates discussed the decision in Addis Ababa, calling it a reset moment for moral diplomacy. One diplomat remarked Burkina Faso has restored the grammar of equality. That sentence spread across African media, poetic, simple, true. Yet not everyone was applauding. Behind closed doors, Western embassies in West Africa drafted quiet warnings. They cautioned that Traoré's rhetoric of sovereignty could isolate Burkina Faso from future investment. But even those same diplomats off the record admitted something remarkable. Since Traoré's rise, Burkina Faso's internal stability had grown. Confidence was replacing dependency, and that trust, not foreign capital, had become his true political currency. Economists began describing the paradox as the Traoré effect. The theory was simple but revolutionary. Moral independence creates economic confidence. Investors paradoxically trust nations that stand firm more than those that bow easily. By refusing the $600 million, Traoré had signaled predictability, a leader guided not by desperation, but by doctrine. Inside, his government ministers adopted new policies shaped by that same philosophy. Contracts were rewritten for transparency. Mining concessions once controlled by foreign companies were reassessed. For the first time, a nation's ethics were dictating its economics. And beyond the numbers, something deeper shifted, a psychological liberation. People who had long equated wealth with progress began to see virtue as a form of power. Teachers quoted Traoré in classrooms. Radio hosts repeated his words, "When a people are free in spirit but not in budget, their independence is a costume." In the villages, elders nodded in agreement. In the cities, youth painted those words on walls. It wasn't just a policy moment, it was a moral awakening. No riots, no revolution, no military parade. Just one decision, quiet, deliberate, unbending, that redefined what leadership could mean in a world addicted to appearance. Burkina Faso had spoken softly, but the world heard loudly. And in that calm after the storm, one truth settled like dust over the global stage. Sometimes the greatest act of power is to walk away from the table with your dignity intact. When the story crossed the Atlantic and reached Washington, the reaction was more curiosity than outrage. There were no official statements, no condemnations, just silence and study. In a world where nearly every government can be swayed with the right amount of funding, Ibrahim Traoré's refusal was an anomaly. An interruption. A question mark in a system built on predictable obedience. Inside the Beltway policy, analysts quietly debated what had just happened. To some, it was a symbolic misstep, an unnecessary rejection of goodwill. But for others, especially in think tanks that track global influence, it was something far more serious, a shift in the moral architecture of diplomacy. Because here was a leader from one of the world's poorest nations refusing to play the transactional game and winning hearts globally for it. That, to Washington, was dangerous. In the U.S., major newspapers cautiously covered the story. The New York Times called it a question of pride. Foreign policy labeled Traoré's stance a moral rebellion disguised as politics. But between the lines, one could read a deeper fear that this small act of defiance could inspire a new kind of independence, one not fueled by weapons or sanctions, but by conviction. European capitals were just as conflicted. In Paris, officials whispered about a growing sovereignty cult spreading across the Sahel. In London, diplomats privately admitted admiration even as they warned of strategic consequences. Brussels, meanwhile, feared contagion not of ideology, but of example. If more nations followed Traoré's lead, the very foundation of aid-based influence would begin to crumble. Multilateral organizations, IMF, World Bank, even the Commonwealth found themselves in an awkward position. How could they promote moral governance when one man had just exposed how often their support packages came with invisible chains? Internal memos circulated, urging officials to reevaluate communication strategies in the Global South bureaucratic language for damage control. But beyond boardrooms and think tanks, the response that mattered most came from ordinary people. In African diaspora communities from Atlanta to Toronto, church leaders and activists saw Traoré's action as spiritual defiance, the reclaiming of a lost moral compass. On radio talk shows, callers said he didn't reject money, he rejected manipulation. Even in the United States, where politics often overshadows principle, the story sparked reflection. Veterans, retirees, and faith-based groups, people who remembered the moral clarity of past generations, began to ask, have we also started measuring integrity by the size of a check? And perhaps that was the quiet genius of Traoré's act. He didn't just challenge Africa's place in the world, he challenged the world's conscience. His refusal forced powerful nations to confront their own contradictions, preaching democracy while practicing dependency, offering charity while preserving control. As one retired U.S. diplomat told The Atlantic, we're watching the emergence of a leader who negotiates not from poverty, but from principle. That's a language we forgot how to speak. In the months that followed, small think pieces began circulating through American academic journals. They spoke of a Ouagadougou doctrine, a new form of diplomacy rooted in moral capital, not financial leverage. Few policymakers took it seriously at first, but those who did saw the writing on the wall. The age of polite submission was ending, and the next global competition wouldn't be over territory or technology, but over who defines integrity. History rarely announces itself with explosions. Sometimes it whispers through a quiet refusal. When Ibrahim Traoré sent back that envelope, he wasn't rejecting Jamaica, he was rejecting a pattern that has shaped global politics for decades: offend, apologize, pay, and repeat. A pattern that confuses wealth with wisdom and generosity with justice. His decision was more than political, it was spiritual. He reminded the world that an apology without reform is just theater, and that forgiveness attached to a price tag is no forgiveness at all. Yet behind the admiration lies a warning. The systems he challenged are old, resilient, and deeply entrenched. They will adapt. They will rebrand dependency with new names, partnerships, development packages, strategic cooperation. And if nations are not careful, the same trap will return, polished, polite, and persuasive. That is why Traoré's gesture matters beyond Africa. Because what he exposed isn't an African problem, it's a global addiction to convenience over conscience. It's the belief that virtue can be outsourced, that progress can be purchased, that nations can cleanse guilt through currency. His silence cut through that illusion like a blade. And for millions watching from Kingston to Kansas, from Dakar to Detroit, it reignited something almost forgotten: moral clarity. In a century drowning in noise, he proved that one word spoken with conviction can still move the world. That word was no. But his no was not rejection, it was redirection. It was a way of saying, we will build, but we will build clean. We will accept help, but not at the cost of our conscience. We will remember that dignity is not a donation, it's a duty. And now the question returns to us, to you, watching this right now. If the tables were turned, if your nation's integrity were on sale for $600 million, what would you choose? Would you take the money or defend the principle? Because perhaps this story isn't only about Africa rising, it's about humanity remembering that true power begins not with what you own, but with what you refuse to sell. If you believe that dignity is worth more than dollars, if you believe that leadership is not about wealth but about will, then share this message. Let others hear the echo from Ouagadougou. Please subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in a world where everyone is buying influence, sometimes the greatest revolution is simply to walk away.